Earth Science Unit 4, Resources and Conservation. In this unit, we'll start off by looking at the objectives, and then what we specifically focus in on this unit is resources and conservation, environmental impacts of mining, fossil fuels in the environment, conservation, and recycling. So our objectives: we want to describe 2 environmental impacts of mining and the use of fossil fuels. We want to explain 2 ways the environmental impacts of mining can be reduced. And then finally identify 3 ways that you can conserve natural resources. We will also talk a little bit about wildlife management and conservation of our wildlife resources in this section. The human footprint. The human footprint is a quantitative analysis of human influence across the globe. In the map, human impact is rated on a scale from 0 being minimum to 100 being maximum for each terrestrial biome. So anything you see darker red has a greater human footprint or a greater human impact. Anything that is the very dark green has a minimal human impact. You will notice that the vast majority of the area in which we live has a great human impact. As you get over towards the west, towards the Rocky Mountains, there's a minimal impact, and then up into portions of Canada and Alaska, again, there is a minimal human impact. A score of 1 indicates the least human influence in a given biome. So again, here's this picture. This is a worldwide view of this picture. You'll notice that a lot of areas that we have the greatest impact on the planet are areas that are coastal. So areas that are right along oceans or waterways. Reason being is that it was easy to transport for, at the least, the last 600-700 years along these waterways. It wasn't until the last 100 years, 150 years, through the advent of the automobile that we've really been able to penetrate the interior of some of the continents. There are 4 types of data that are used to measure human influence. The first one is population density. So is that area, does it have a very large human population? Next one is land transformation. So have we as humans transformed land into something new, whether that be agriculture, damming of rivers and streams to form reservoirs, or paving it over for development? Human access. Is the land easily accessible to humans? Some areas are not easily accessible. The Rocky Mountains is a perfect example of that in the United States. It's an area of land that is extremely difficult to access. And then finally, power infrastructure. Obviously, people are not going to live in abundance in areas where there isn't good power infrastructure. So if people are not able to live there, there's going to be minimal human influence. Although increased human population often leads to sharper species and ecosystem declines, land transformation poses the single greatest threat to biodiversity. Remember, biodiversity is the number of different species of organisms within an environment. It is important to have biodiversity. When we transform the land, it results in habitat loss and or fragmentation, which leads to a decline in biodiversity. Increased human access through roads, rivers, and coastlines can lead to more pollution and invasive species as well. This is something probably you have seen in the past. The Great Lakes Most Unwanted. This is a number of invasive species that have occurred in the Great Lakes region. It's important to note that invasive species are not only affecting the Great Lakes. Invasive species could be Great Lakes natural native species moving into other parts of the world. Both human access and land transformation have been fueled by increased access to fossil fuels and electrical power. So as we've become better at getting fossil fuels, as we've become better at producing electrical energy, we have had a greater amount of transformation to the land. Humans in the Earth system. All natural cycles can be altered by human activities. So we've talked quite a bit in the past about natural cycles on our planet. These natural cycles are easily influenced by the actions that we have. The carbon cycle, for example, is affected when humans use fossil fuels. So as we burn fossil fuels in automobiles, as we use them in industry, those fossil fuels, as we burn them, release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is thought to be a greenhouse gas that traps heat. If that is the case, we are slowly going to notice an increase in temperature worldwide. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles are affected by agriculture. If we're taking nitrogen and phosphorus and different compounds of them, and we are using them to help grow plants, we need to think about where do we put those materials. Well, we typically put them on the fields that we're farming. So other areas can be nutrient deprived of phosphorus and nitrogen, whereas these fields that we continue to fertilize may be nutrient rich with nitrogen and phosphorus. Humans must be careful to moderate their influence on natural systems. Resources and conservation. The limited supply of fossil fuels and other traditional energy resources has inspired research into possible new energy resources. Scientists are studying how the use of traditional energy sources affect Earth's ecosystems. So what is happening when we use fossil fuels, when we are burning those fossil fuels on a regular basis? Is it negatively impacting the ocean systems? Is it negatively impacting the atmosphere, or the biosphere, or the geosphere? There's a number of questions that arise, and scientists are trying to answer those questions. Scientists estimate that the worldwide coal reserves will last about 200 more years, and within 20 years, humans will have used up half of our oil supply on our planet. So we are drastically reducing the amount of fossil fuels due to the amount of demand that we have for them. If we don't find ways to come up with alternative energy resources, we're going to run into a situation where those energy resources become so expensive that people just plain can't afford them. And then it'll be a situation where only the rich and the wealthy will be using those resources, and we'll have to go back to riding bicycles and things like motorcycles, just because that's what people will be able to afford. Unless, of course, we find alternate energy sources that can be used to power our automobiles and power our industry. We also have learned that the mining that we do can damage or destroy fragile ecosystems. Also, fossil fuels and nuclear power may add pollution to Earth's air, water, and soil. Environmental impacts of mining. Mining can cause a variety of environmental problems. Mining may cause both air and noise pollution, water pollution, increased erosion and soil degradation, formation of sinkholes, and also the destruction of wildlife habitats. Because fires in coal mines are difficult to put out, they are commonly left to burn out. So that increases the amount of pollution that's in the atmosphere and smog in the atmosphere just simply from the burning process. Sometimes these coal mine fires can actually take decades or centuries to eventually burn themselves out. The coal just gets enough oxygen for it to smolder underground, and it continues to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, along with a number of other gases. So we've come up with some mining regulations. The United States has federal and state laws that regulate the operation of mines. It helps to prevent mining operations from contaminating local air, water, and soil resources. All mining operations also have to comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act. That act protects threatened or endangered species and their habitats from being destroyed. It's interesting, this has been kind of a debate in Michigan for a long period of time, and it keeps going back and forth. There is a mine that occurs up by Marquette, Michigan. That mine is harvesting copper and iron ore. The mine is right next to a river that hosts one of the very last populations of coaster brook trout in our state and even in our country. Coaster brook trout are basically a migratory brook trout that live in Lake Superior, and then they migrate into this river to spawn every year. And this company that's mining it, they continue to take it to court and say, well, this coaster brook trout is not really an endangered species. It's actually just a subspecies of brook trout, so if we harm the ecosystem, it's not really eliminating an endangered species. Whereas other groups have fought it and said, no, this is an endangered species. You can't mine around this river because the Federal Endangered Species Act protects these fish. And so basically it just depends on what court system this ends up in. About every 5 to 10 years it gets flip-flopped, and a judge will say, okay, you can mine this area near the river, and then they'll mine for a few years, and then another judge will pick it up because it's been appealed, and then the new judge will say, nope, you're not allowed to mine this area. So it just kind of keeps flip-flopping back and forth. With regard to mining regulations, mine reclamation is part of this. Reclamation helps to reduce the long-lasting environmental impact of mining. So reclamation is just simply returning the land to the natural environment that was there prior to the mining process. You can see this picture right here. This picture is actually from Pike County, Illinois, where a mine used to be. After the mining was completely done, they had to restore the area back to its natural, I guess beauty would be the best way to explain that. So they had to supply trees, shrubs, grasses, had to put in a certain number of waterways, and different things like that, which then allowed organisms to return to that environment. It helps to reduce the long-lasting environmental impacts of mining, and companies are required to return mined land to its original condition after mining is complete. And then even outside of that, when you're driving along like the new section of 127 south of St. John's, you'll notice that there's some areas in there where there's some small wetland habitats or small marshes or small ponds and different things like that. The reason that those are there is because for every one of those that are destroyed in the process of creating that highway, they had to return a new one of the same square foot to the environment. And so once they get done with this process of creating the roadway, they go back in and they have to go through this process of I guess it would be more like land reclamation than it would be mine reclamation. Fossil fuels in the environment. Fossil fuel procurement affects the environment and contributes to air pollution. Strip mining removes plants and topsoil. The exposed land often erodes quickly, and it will create runoffs of acid rain into nearby rivers and streams. I guess in that case it'd be acid runoff instead of acid rain. Burning coal releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide, SO2, into the atmosphere. When SO2 combines with water in the air, acid precipitation forms. The burning of gasoline in cars is a major contributor to air pollution. So, quick quiz. Name 2 ways the use of fossil fuels affects the environment. There's a number of ways in which fossil fuels affect the environment, but a couple examples here would be the use of fossil fuels affect the environment when coal is mined from the surface, which destroys the land. When fossil fuels are burned, they affect the environment by creating air pollution, and it could be if sulfur dioxide is released, it would create acid rain as well.
The best way to conserve natural resources is to use less of them. For example, using the same cloth bag each time you go grocery shopping instead of using new plastic bags each time will reduce pollution associated with both the manufacture of the bag and with the subsequent disposal of the bag. Reusing is an important way to conserve resources. For example, clothes that no longer fit can be donated to be reused rather than thrown away. Recycling is a special form of reuse. Recycling is the process of breaking down trash and using the materials again. Plastics, paper, aluminum cans, and glass are some materials that can be recycled.
Conservation. Conservation is the preservation and wise use of natural resources. You may be familiar with the MUCC, Michigan United Conservation Clubs. Their main goal is to protect wildlife habitats and also to allow sportsmen the opportunity to hunt some game species in our state as well. Conservation can help reduce the environmental damage and the amount of pollution that can result from the mining and use of natural resources. By conserving natural resources, people can ensure that limited natural resources last longer. So when we're talking about conservation, we're talking a lot about both those renewable resources and also those non-renewable resources. So if we're conserving things and we are using them wisely, they're going to last longer and future generations are going to have more of them available to them. Mineral conservation. Recycling is the process of recovering valuable or useful materials from waste or scrap, the process of reusing some items. Recycling requires energy, but recycling uses less energy than the mining and manufacturing of new resources. So it's important to realize there is more energy use in going out and digging up the ground and mining to get a resource than there is for us to recycle or reuse those resources. Here are some pictures of some different things that are commonly recycled. Aluminum cans we're probably most familiar with, or glass cans, but you can also recycle boxes, recycle magazines, ink cartridges for computers, electronic equipment is recyclable, newspapers, books, and many, many other things. Another way to conserve minerals is to use other abundant or renewable materials in place of scarce or non-renewable materials. So it's important for us to think about, is there an alternative material that I could use in place of the product that I am currently using that is maybe a non-renewable resource? Fossil fuel conservation. Fossil fuels can be conserved by reducing the amount of energy used every day, reducing the amount of draining as far as water goes, driving, insulation for a house, energy efficient appliances. All of these help to conserve energy. It's also important to note that when we're talking about limiting our energy use, shutting off lights inside of the house, using full loads of laundry or doing full loads of laundry instead of partial loads of laundry are definitely going to be beneficial as well. Anything that is plugged into the wall, we need to think about, where does that energy come from? The vast majority of that energy comes from a coal burning facility or a natural gas burning facility that generates electricity. As those facilities generate electricity, it's then put into the power grid and sent to your home. That's why when you hear about people all the time getting these electronic cars and about how they're being conservationists and they're saving the planet, you can't really buy into that, because let's think about where the power comes from for that electric car. You plug the electric car in at home, the power came from some type of facility that's burning fossil fuels or burning other non-renewable resources in order to create that power. So the footprint is just as big with the use of an electric car as it is with your automobile that burns gas. Conservation of other natural resources. Some scientists estimate that by the year 2025, the world will have a critical shortage of freshwater resources. Now, Michigan doesn't necessarily have this situation going on. We have water in abundance. However, it is important for us to note that if the water in our state starts getting sent elsewhere, we may end up in a critical shortage at some point. There's been some legislation with the Great Lakes bordering states along with Canada that has has stopped any movement of our Great Lakes water outside of the Great Lakes states. That's not to say that in the future that legislation or those laws may not change. Recycling. You're probably all familiar with recycling. Sorting out materials that can be turned into new materials. And last in this unit, we're going to talk a little bit about wildlife management. Wildlife management attempts to balance the needs of wildlife with the needs of people. Wildlife management can include game keeping, wildlife conservation, and also pest control. The picture that you see here is a group of individuals that work for a Natural Resource Commission, and they are actually shocking this body of water, much like what we'll do in the Salmon Release Project. They are taking those wands, they're shocking any fish. The fish kind of become, I guess, without a better word, is just stunned. They float up to the surface. The guy behind with the net scoops them up. They're measured and released unharmed in the river behind them or stream behind them. We will see this process in action when we do our Salmon Release Day. This is an example of pest control. Wildlife management has become an integrated science using disciplines such as mathematics, chemistry, biology, ecology, climatology, and geography to gain the best results. Wildlife conservation aims to halt the loss in the Earth's biodiversity by taking into consideration ecological principles such as carrying capacity, so the number of organisms that can survive within a given environment. Every ecosystem has a carrying capacity. For example, rabbits may be allowed to have 200 within a given environment. Any more than that, and disease and illness take over, and the lack of food starts to take over, and those organisms start to die off. Typically, environments have highs and lows with regard to their populations. One year there may be a high population of rabbits, and then those rabbits eat up the majority of the food that's available. They get sick because they're in contact with one another a lot, and the population goes through a decline. And so the next year there may be a lower number of rabbits, and then followed by the year after that they may increase again. So carrying capacity is the total number of organisms that can survive within an environment. Disturbance. Succession. Succession is going to be the stepwise process that happens in an environment where it changes from basically just a regular field into a woodland. So fields eventually grow shrubs. The shrubs eventually lead into moderate-sized trees. The moderate-sized trees eventually lead into hardwood trees. Environmental conditions such as physical geography and hydrology. So does the physical environment affect the wildlife populations? And does the amount of water affect the wildlife population? The aim is to balance the needs of wildlife with the needs of people. Most wildlife biologists are concerned with the preservation and improvement of habitats. Most wildlife biologists don't necessarily work with the animals themselves. Now that's not to say that a few of them do not. But most wildlife biologists are concerned with setting up a habitat that allows those organisms to survive and thrive. Techniques can include reforestation, pest control, nitrification, denitrification, and irrigation. Gamekeeping is the management or control of wildlife for the well-being of game, and it may include killing other animals which share the same niche or the predators to maintain a high population of a more profitable species. So an example of this. For a long time in the United States, we killed predators like mountain lions and wolves. We didn't like them near our livestock. We didn't like them attacking our deer and our deer herds. So when we harvested out those predators, or any other organism that is not a desired organism that may negatively affect the populations of animals we like, we changed the population dynamics as a whole. Sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. Pest control is the control of real or perceived pests. It can be for the benefit of wildlife, farmers, gamekeepers, or for safety reasons. So if you have a large population of raccoons living around your house, you may start noticing some of them start getting diseases like mange or rabies. So that would be a safety concern. You'd want to eliminate a number of those organisms from the population so the population is not affected by those diseases as a whole. In the United States, wildlife management practices are often implemented by a governmental agency to uphold a law. For example, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Many wildlife managers are employed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and by state agencies. Our state agency is the Michigan Department of Natural Resources.